Picture a kitchen table in 1929, somewhere in America, with a fat annual almanac lying open on it. The kind of book a family kept beside the radio, full of tide tables and postal rates, and in between them, advertisements. One of those advertisements is selling a mail-order course in mind training. It promises the secret of self-confidence, of a strong will, of a powerful memory, for the price of a 2-cent stamp. Near the top, in confident print, sits one sentence doing all the work. Scientists and psychologists tell us, it says, that we use only about 10% of our brain power. No scientist is named. Hold on to that detail. It is the seed of everything tonight. Come in, friends. The chair's soft, the night's slow, and nothing out there needs you before morning. Let the day finish filing itself. You're done being consulted. Tonight is the 10% brain, the number everyone has heard, where it actually came from, and the boy who was raised to prove it. You have met this number somewhere. A teacher, a coach, a movie, a poster. Most people half believe it, because it is a lovely thing to believe. It means there is an unopened room in your own head, where everything you haven't managed yet is simply waiting behind the door. Tonight I'll tell you the story of that number, a story kinder and stranger than the number itself. The shape, so you can hold it loosely. The promise first, then the files, then a quiet close. The promise gets told first, the way it has always been sold, and then the documents take it back one page at a time. And where the trail goes dark, I'll say so, and the dark stays yours. There's a boy in this story I'm going to hand it to near the end. He was built for this legend before it had its number, and what became of him is the truest thing in the whole file. And if you drift before the files open, good. The number has waited a century. It will keep till tomorrow. So, the promise, the way the world has always sold it. The story goes like this, told to you in classrooms, locker rooms, and late-night conversations for as long as anyone alive can remember. Your brain, the story says, is a great house, and you live in one small wing of it, 10%. The lights are on in that wing. The kettle works. It is where you keep everything you know how to do. And down the hall, behind a door nobody ever opened for you, sits the other 90%. Room after room of it, furnished and waiting. Genius is in there, the story goes. Perfect memory is in there. Languages you could learn in a week. Calm you cannot imagine. Maybe stranger things. The tale has never been shy about the stranger things. All of it yours already, the promise insists, the way an inheritance is yours before the reading of the will. Stand in the tale's own showroom a moment, because the tale always furnishes it beautifully. The seminar leader at the whiteboard, drawing the brain as a pie with one thin slice shaded. The paperback with the glowing head on the cover, the guidance office poster, the late-night radio guest, the uncle at the holiday table who read something about it once, all of them handing along the same house key. That is the pitch. Notice how gentle it is. The story never says you are lacking. It says the opposite. You are overflowing, merely unintroduced to yourself. Every failure gets reframed as a door not yet found. Every wish a matter of hallway navigation. As promises go, this is among the kindest ever sold, which is a large part of why it has never stopped selling. The sellers, as the tale has employed them, have ranged from the respectable to the theatrical. The mind training courses of a century ago sold The Locked Wing by mail. The seminar circuit sold it from hotel ballrooms. And the psychics, the tale's most enthusiastic tenants, sold it as their own home address. The spoon-benders and mind-readers of the 20th century explained, when asked, that they had simply gotten further down the hall than the rest of us. One famous mentalist's mail-order kit told buyers, in effect, that most of us use about 10% of our brains, if that, the remaining 90 being untapped potential, undiscovered abilities, yours for the exercises enclosed. And the tale carries one more flourish, its celebrity endorsement, repeated in 1,000 classrooms. Einstein himself, so the story goes, once said the 10% was all even he ever used. I'll tell you now, because the flourish is itself part of the folklore. When a determined researcher went looking, the Einstein archives held no record of any such remark, anywhere, ever. The legend had quietly written its own testimonial, which does not embarrass the legend in the slightest. A story this comfortable prints whatever letterhead it needs. The promise had one more conquest left, its biggest, the movies. That part of the tale is still in theatres, and it is next. By our own century, the story had earned the biggest room a story can get, a movie theatre. In 2011, a film called Limitless put the promise in pill form. One tablet, the whole house unlocked. A struggling writer abruptly finishing books, beating markets, running for office. And in 2014 came the tale's grandest telling, a film called Lucy, in which no less a voice than Morgan Freeman, playing a professor at a lectern, delivers the 10% claim to a packed hall and to the planet, while the film's heroine, dosed with something extraordinary, climbs past 10% on an on-screen counter. 20, 40. The audience watches the number rise the way you watch a kettle, knowing it must reach the top. At 100%, she exceeds the reach of ordinary reality altogether, which is the locked wing promise taken to its logical rooftop. The film earned more than $450 million. Here is the detail I love, the first honest crack in the whole evening, and it comes from the man who made that film. Asked about the science, the director, Luc Besson, didn't defend it for a moment. It's totally not true. He'd worked on the film for 9 years. He knew the premise was a fable. He used it anyway, the way storytellers have always used a good door in a wall. Even the myth's biggest salesman, in other words, was not a believer. A teller, rather, who knew exactly which shelf the story lived on. So there is the promise, told the way it has always been told. The locked wing, the waiting 90%, the endorsements real and invented, the counter climbing toward everything you were meant to be. It stands on one load-bearing claim, that somebody, somewhere, in a laboratory, once measured the mind and found it 9/10 empty. Now we do what I promised at the lamp. The files come out, oldest first, following the number back. Through a philosopher who never said it, a boy who was built to prove it, an adman who printed it, a radio announcer who pinned it on a dead man's coat. Some of what the files hold answers the promise. Some of it, honestly, only deepens it. I'll be plain about which is which. The first file belongs to the philosopher. It opens on the side of a mountain. In July of 1898, a 56-year-old Harvard professor named William James, the founder of American psychology, brother of the novelist, one of the most famous thinkers alive, shouldered an 18-pound pack and climbed Mount Marcy, the highest peak in the Adirondacks. That night he barely slept, lying out under the sky in a state he described in a letter, in his own words, as one of the happiest lonesome nights of my existence. The next day, according to the family record, he walked 10.5 hours of the hardest walking of his life, and somewhere on that trail, the record says, he strained his heart in a way that never fully mended. A strange, fitting overture. The man about to become famous for saying we have more in us than we spend, discovering on a mountainside both the second wind and the bill for it. Where did that famous address come from? The file keeps its seed. In the spring of 1906, a Polish philosopher wrote to James, 60 pages, on yoga, on the disciplines of energy, from a man so torrential he was known to answer a postcard with 8 sheets. James wrote back a private letter in which the whole idea first stands up. Most people, he told his correspondent, live in a very restricted circle of their potential being. Months later, James said it from the grandest lectern he had. In December of 1906, an aging James stood before the American Philosophical Association and gave the address the whole legend descends from, an address on the energies of men, whose argument was about habit and fatigue, that people settle into using less of themselves than they have, the way a person stops exploring a big house, though crises, passions, disciplines can push through the fatigue wall into reserves we forget we own. His actual words in the published text, we make use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. A small part. Read the address end to end. You can, it's in the file. And there is no number in it. Not 10%, not any percent. No anatomy either. James was describing energy and habit, not tissue. And here is the quiet thing worth carrying to bed. What he actually said is true. Actually true. Felt by you personally. Every person who ever found a second wind, or discovered under pressure that they could do the thing they were sure they couldn't, has run James's experiment and confirmed it. The philosopher gave the world a true observation about effort. The world, in time, would hand it back as a false number about the brain. The number needed a middleman, several in fact, and the first of them was James's own student, who decided to prove the reserves were real in the most direct way imaginable, by raising a child on them. That file is next. It is the heart of the night. Boris Sidis had arrived from the old Russian Empire in 1887, 20 years old, nearly penniless, speaking little English. And inside a decade he was one of William James's own students at Harvard, then a psychiatrist with James writing the introduction to his first book. He married a formidable student named Sarah, who became one of the earliest women physicians of her generation. He had taught her geometry during their courtship. 3 weeks of geometry the family never stopped retelling. And when their son was born in Boston on the 1st of April, 1898, they named him for the teacher, William James Sidis. Boris believed his mentor's reserve energy doctrine to the marrow, believed the small part was not a metaphor but a method. So, in the words of a journalist who wrote it up with the family's cooperation, he resolved to put the theory to the test of experiment. The experiment was the boy. The family's own telling keeps the furniture, and it is worth standing in. Alphabet blocks bought with what was left of $20. The baby's first word, door, because the door moves. People come through it. The word spelled out in blocks on the floor. A bedroom fitted out like a little museum with a revolving globe. Arithmetic through dominoes at the edge of the dinner table, an hour every evening, until, the family says, The boy's interest slid from the toys to the principles underneath them. He could fetch a requested book off the shelf before he was 2. He was reading well at 3. At about that age, he typed a letter to a toy store on his own. The family kept it, reasoning in it that being able to typewrite made him very old, like his father, then closing with the finest sentence any 3-year-old has committed to paper. Maybe I am 100 years old. At 6, he went through 7 grades of the public schools of Brookline, their Boston suburb, in half a year. At 11, in September of 1909, Harvard admitted him as a special student, the youngest it had ever taken. And on the evening of January 5, 1910, the experiment stood up in public. Conant Hall on the Harvard campus. The university's mathematical club had drawn its largest attendance of the year. The papers counted more than 75 professors, instructors, and invited guests to hear a lecture on the geometry of 4-dimensional bodies. The lecturer was 11 years old, in knickerbockers. According to the accounts printed the next morning, he held that room for upward of an hour and a half. Grown mathematicians, some of them, admitted afterward they had not followed him to the end. You already feel what that room felt, because it is the same thing the almanac ad would be selling 19 years later. The reserves are real. Look at the boy. The doors in the mind can be opened, early and wide, if only somebody has the method. Newspapers across the country carried him as exactly that, the proof. What the room could not see was the bill. The file's next page is the one the legend never reads aloud. We will turn it gently. At 17, he was sent to teach mathematics at a new university in Texas called the Rice Institute. A graduate fellow younger than his own students who mocked him while the press kept arriving. He lasted under a year. His biographer records him saying of it with a shrug you can almost hear, "I'm not much of a teacher." He went back east into Harvard Law School, walking away from that too in his final year, quietly. Then came the afternoon that ended his public life. May Day, 1919. A socialist parade in Boston turned into a riot. Among the 100 people herded into the Roxbury court stood William Sidis, 21, Harvard's famous boy graduate. Patrolmen testified he had carried a red flag. His bail was set at $5,000. The papers noted it was the highest demanded of anyone in that courtroom, famous names being useful that way. At the trial, the judge asked whether he believed in what the American flag stands for. The exchange survives in the next day's Tribune, where his answer has all of him in it. He believed in the American form of government, he said, to the extent of the Declaration of Independence. 18 months, the court said, for rioting, for assault upon an officer. He never served a day of it. While the appeal hung, his parents used their standing to keep him out and took him instead to their own sanatorium in New Hampshire for a year, then to California for another until the case was allowed to lapse. The family record, told through his biographer, says he experienced that rescue as captivity, with the threat of worse held over him, and that he never forgave them. The experiment's designers, saving their proof the only way they knew, at the price of whatever was left between them. I make no verdict on any of them here. They had believed a kind promise, and the believing was the whole house he grew up in. 5 years later, a reporter found him. January 1924, New York. The wonder boy of Conant Hall, now working. The wire story is in the file, verbatim, as a $23 a week statistical clerk, living in a rented room, estranged from what remained of his family, asking only to be left in peace at work which did not require, in his own reported words, too much thinking. The papers ran it as tragedy, then kept running versions of it for the rest of his life. He collected streetcar transfers, writing a 300-page treatise on them under a false name, privately printed. He wrote a strange, earnest book of cosmology under his own name. It sank without a single review. The world came for him one last time. In 1937, the New Yorker magazine ran a long, needling profile of him, part of a series called Where Are They Now?, cataloguing the rented room, the transfers, the shabby coat. Sidis sued the magazine. His ground was then nearly unheard of, that a private man has a right to be let alone. The suit climbed the federal courts while he clerked by day. In 1940, the ruling came down against him. Once famous, the law said, in effect, always reachable. Law students still study that case. Almost none of them learn what the boy had been. He died in Boston in the summer of 1944, at 46, in a rented room, quietly. Here is what the file will not let the legend have. The boy raised to prove the unopened room did not fail to find it. He found all of it, the languages, the mathematics, the room after room, then spent 20 years asking for the one thing the promise never priced, the right to close the door. Whatever the reserves are, he is not their proof and not their refutation. He is the reminder, filed under a false name among the streetcar transfers, that a person is not a wing of a house. The number, meanwhile, was about to be born in an advertising office. That file is next. Now the advertisement from the kitchen table, because the file can finally read it properly. It was written in 1928 by a man named Maxwell Sackheim, one of the great mail-order copywriters, a professional at converting longing into coupons, for the Pellman Institute's Mind Training course. It ran in the 1929 World Almanac. There is the sentence, in confident print. Scientists and psychologists tell us we use only about 10% of our brain power. The course claimed 650,000 students worldwide. It promised confidence, will, memory, concentration. It asked for a 2-cent stamp. And no scientist is named, because no scientist had said it. Somewhere between James's A Small Part and Sackheim's typewriter, a feeling acquired a decimal. Who first performed that surgery, nobody has ever established. The researcher who spent the most patient years tracing it, a neuroscientist named Barry Beierstein, the myth's great detective, followed the trail back through the self-help circuit of the 20s, finally calling what he found there a hall of mirrors. Everyone quoting somebody, nobody the source. So the honest phrasing, tonight and always, is this. The 1929 ad is the earliest appearance anyone has ever found. It is where the number first turns up in the light, never on the record where it began. The dark before it stays dark, and the dark is part of the story. The number still needed its great vehicle. Picture where the vehicle was built. January 1935. The Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Pennsylvania in New York, where 2,500 Depression-era men and women, clerks, salesmen, the worried and the hopeful, packed the floor to hear a teacher of public speaking named Dale Carnegie promise them effectiveness, confidence, influence. A publisher stood watching that crowd, doing arithmetic of his own. The book Carnegie wrote from those lectures appeared in 1936 How to Win Friends and Influence People, on its way to some 30 million copies. And at the front of Carnegie's book sat a foreword written by a friend of his, Lowell Thomas, the radio broadcaster whose voice had made Lawrence of Arabia a legend. In that foreword, Thomas attributed to Professor William James of Harvard the claim that the average man develops only 10% of his latent mental ability. I give you that as a paraphrase deliberately. The exact wording has never, to the file's knowledge, been pinned against a first printing. This show doesn't quote what it can't pin. But the substance is beyond dispute. So is the arithmetic of what happened next. A number no scientist had measured, wearing a dead philosopher's name, riding the best-selling self-help book in history into every parlor in America. James had said a small part about energy and habit. 26 years after his death, he was on record everywhere saying 10% about the brain. The man who spent a career studying how ideas harden into habit became the host organism for the century's hardiest example. Somewhere, one hopes, that amused him. But surely, you might reasonably ask, the scientists push back? They did something better. They went and checked. That file is next. Because here is the strangest page in the whole file. Even science's corrections got recruited by the myth. 3 times in the 20th century, careful laboratory work was translated, on its way to the public, into fresh evidence for the locked wing. And each translation was an honest mistake. The first belongs to Carl Lashley and his rats. Through the 20s and 30s, Lashley trained rats to run mazes, then surgically removed portions of their cortex, larger and larger portions, watching them, remarkably, still run their mazes. The popular retelling wrote itself. The removed parts must not have been doing anything. That is not what Lashley found, and not what he said. His rats were worse, just not worse in the tidy, localized way anyone expected. His real discovery was that memory is smeared across the brain, distributed and redundant, like a rumor no single person holds all of. The finding that the brain backs itself up became, in the retelling, the finding that the brain is mostly empty, an insurance policy, mistaken for a vacancy. The second belongs to Wilder Penfield, the great neurosurgeon, who in the operating rooms of the 30s and 40s mapped living human brains with a gentle electrode. Touch here, and a finger twitches. Touch there, and the patient tastes something, hears music, remembers. But across vast stretches of the cortex, the electrode produced nothing. No twitch, no taste, no memory. Penfield's own careful term for such territory amounted to uncommitted. The public heard silent, and silence slid easily into unused. The silence, of course, belonged to the instrument, not the tissue. Those quiet stretches turned out to house the most human things we do: language, planning, judgment, the assembling of a self. Work too distributed for one electrode to summon with a tap. The best rooms in the house simply don't answer the doorbell. And the third was a bookkeeping error. For decades, the textbooks said the brain's support cells outnumbered its neurons 10-1, which let a popularizer say, with a straight face, that only 1 cell in 10 actually thinks. When somebody finally counted properly, a Brazilian scientist in 2009, dissolving brains into a countable soup, the famous ratio collapsed to roughly 1-1. The arithmetic under the myth had never been done until the century after the myth needed it. 3 honest errors, all bending the same direction, because a mistranslation survives in proportion to how much people want it to be true. Nobody lied. everybody rounded toward the door in the wall. What the instruments actually show, once the errors are cleared, that file is the next one, and it is where the story turns kind again. Start with the electric bill because it settles the matter almost by itself. Your brain is about 2% of your body's weight, yet it burns roughly 20% of your body's resting fuel. A fifth of everything you eat spent above the neck around the clock. Evolution is a ruthless accountant. It does not carry a 9/10 vacant building at those rates for 100,000 years. Any ancestor hauling 90% dead weight in the most expensive organ ever grown would have been outcompeted by leaner heads long before history started writing itself down. The idle brain fails before any laboratory at the level of the grocery bill. The laboratories agree anyway. When the scanners arrived, the machines that watch blood and sugar move through living, thinking heads, they found no dark continent. Over the course of an ordinary day, virtually every region of the brain shows up for work. Reading, walking, remembering, daydreaming, sleeping. Sleeping especially, some of the busiest signatures ever recorded come from brains that are, by their owner's account, doing nothing at all. Hold that oddity. The close of the night lives inside it. Now, the one wrinkle honesty requires, because a clever listener may have heard it. In any single instant, only a small fraction of your neurons are firing hard. True, the energy budget allows nothing else. The whole instrument runs on about 20 watts, dimmer than the bulb in your refrigerator. But sparse is not idle. Think of a piano. At any instant, a few keys are sounding, yet by the end of an evening, every key has been played. No one would call the quiet ones unnecessary. The brain is a piano with no spare keys. Cut any of it away, the clinics have a century of proof. Something is lost. A word shape, a face, a temper, a name. There is no region a surgeon can take for free. 90% spare was always a fantasy. 0% spare is the measured, slightly humbling truth. And yet the belief holds, which researchers have measured again and again. Ask school teachers, the surveys find, and about half say yes, the 10% is real. Ask the general public, most say yes. Ask people who have studied actual neuroscience, nearly half say yes, still. Hold all those numbers loosely. Survey takers argue that a true or false question forces a guess, while guesses lean toward the familiar. But the shape underneath is not really in doubt, and there is no shame anywhere in it. Believing was always the path of least resistance, because the claim never behaved like a fact. It behaved like a hope with a decimal point, and hopes are not dislodged by pie charts. Which leaves the best question of the night, the one the myth accidentally kept alive. If all of the brain is busy, what is most of that busyness for? Because the counting age found something in the resting brain it still cannot explain, and that is the last file. Here is the finding that quietly reorganized the field, and it began as an annoyance. Brain scanners were built to watch the brain do things, so researchers would measure a person at rest, then measure them at a task, then subtract one picture from the other. The annoyance was what the subtraction showed. Almost nothing. The hardest thinking you can order a person to do, reading, calculating, remembering, barely moves the brain's fuel needle at all. Say it the simple way, because this is the most important sentence in the file. Nearly everything your brain spends, it spends on its own private business, whether or not you are asking anything of it. The tasks of your waking life are a whisper on top of a hum, and the hum is almost the whole of the bill. The scientist who pressed hardest on this, Marcus Raichle, borrowed a phrase from the cosmologists and called it the brain's dark energy, the vast expenditure that is simply always running underneath. Stranger still, his group mapped a set of regions that grow busier still the moment you stop doing things. A network that lights up for daydreaming, remembering, imagining what tomorrow holds, dimming when the world demands your attention. The busiest hour of some circuits is the one where you stare out a window. What is all that spending for? This is the genuinely open door, and I'll leave it exactly as open as the journals do. Rehearsal, some argue, the brain running its models of the world in the dark, the way a theatre runs lines before the house opens. Consolidation, say others, the day's memories being carried from short-term shelves to long-term vaults, much of it during sleep. Prediction, readiness, maintenance of the self's continuity. Every one of these is defended in print by serious people, and none has won. The myth said 9/10 of you sits dark and waiting. The measured truth is almost perfectly inverted, and better. Close to 100% is working, and most of the work is on something no one has yet been able to name. So the unopened room turns out to be real after all. It was never locked. It was never idle. No course with a 2-cent stamp was ever going to open it, because you are already inside it. It is running now, this minute, spending most of your brain's fuel on business it has never once reported to you. What you believe is waiting in there. Genius, rest, the better you. The file honestly cannot say. The file only says, something is, and it is busy. One last page, and then the quiet. So let the two endings stand side by side, at their honest equal weight, and choose neither. In the first, the 10% brain is pure invention, an admen's decimal, orphaned of any experiment, pinned posthumously on a philosopher, carried into 30 million homes in somebody else's foreword, and kept alive for a century because no meta-analysis ever beat a promise. In the second, it is a mangled truth, because James was right, and you know he was right. People do live below their possible energies. There are second winds. The walls that hold most of us are habit and fatigue, not anatomy. So the myth is simply that truth, wearing a number it never earned, sold by people who needed it to be about the brain, because effort is harder to package than percentage. The record holds both endings comfortably. It is in no hurry to decide, and neither are we. And the boy, remember him once more gently, because he was the whole promise made flesh before it had its number. William James Sidis was given every room in the house at once, and what he asked for in the end was a small one, a desk, a stack of streetcar transfers, work that didn't require too much thinking, and the right to be let alone. The experiment proved nothing about 10% or 90%. It proved that a mind is not a reserve to be opened, but a person to be left in some peace, which may be the only finding in tonight's whole file that nobody has ever disputed. As for you, the mind you're falling asleep inside is running its full self at this moment, all 100%, on something like 20 watts, dimmer than the light you just turned off. In a few minutes, when you stop listening altogether, parts of it will grow busier, filing the day, running its quiet rehearsals, spending that unexplained 95% on work it has never explained to anyone. Nothing is locked. Nothing is idle. Nothing is required of you at all. The house is awake all night, every room of it, keeping ways it has always known. You're just the one it lets sleep, and that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here